Have you ever been so utterly captivated within the first few minutes of playing a game? You look at the reviews telling you that it's amazing, but in your own mind, you don't really believe them. Yet, it's a genre you never really tried before or played, and from a developer you never heard of before. But somehow, within the first few minutes of booting it up and trying it, what you witnessed provided you with that childlike wonderment, that itch, that special something that makes you smile ear to ear, as fun for fun's sake hits you like a metaphorical truck. For me, Absolum fulfills that special something and then some, and I'd say it's worthy of Game of the Year material, not in the traditional sense of producing something that breaks the boundaries of the medium, but how concrete and fantastic its implementation mechanics are, which the level of interaction of its action gameplay easily beats many options on the market currently in how it feels to play. So to be fair, I've never actually played a beat-em-up game ever growing up, as it was something I was aware of, yet never really got into. I'm inclined to try new game genres and experiences, yet somehow I've never really caught on with the beat-em-up genre, as the closest thing adjacent was probably something like Metal Slug. But that's more of a Contra-like experience, and trying a beat-em-up required some orientating with the general mechanics and know-how. Anyhow, I was only vaguely aware of what beat-em-ups were like, and I know the general tropes, but if you've never played one, well, it's a bit of a learning curve. However, I played plenty of roguelikes and I'm a huge fan of those. Turns out, if you combine anything with roguelike elements, I'd probably check it out. Many people mention the similarity to Hades specifically, and yeah, I can see it in a way how elements or statuses work with rewards per stage, or extra rewards for choosing something out of your ordinary. Dialogue that references a buildup of previous interactions across its stages and villains, and a plot-supported reason of why you can keep trying beyond death.
Death is just another step on your journey. You are enduring your challenges. I cannot ask for more.
If I had to describe the game design, it would be on the lines of firmly grounded in functional expression. The moment you see an enemy design, you are cued implicitly of what it does or what it can do. Note specifically how few enemies there are that fit the specific size and proportions of the player, as the game takes careful, dare say strict, consideration of form-following function. It makes sense given how chaotic the game can get when that you should be able to identify things quickly. The way the game is designed prioritizes action gameplay absolutely foremost, which story and other background elements take a backseat in comparison, or at least is designed intentionally in a way which secondary elements may or may not complement the main focus fully. Yet, I think the player should take a kind of suspension of disbelief in the way that the game wants you to roll with how it presents itself. Perhaps the design can be described loosely in a line like, I want to put cool stuff in the game without necessarily having a good or extensively deep explanation of why it exists, is how I see some of its design philosophy. While background elements could be reasonably, although I wouldn't say absolutely, overlooked, but understandably should not be a focal point of dissension. It's intentionally providing a loose scenario in which you can have bits of what the developers like, essentially. Whether this resonates similarly for you is of course my view, as in my opinion there's a slight clash between what I just mentioned and the game's attempt to tell a serious story, which it does. Overall, it is molded in a way that appears to affirm an action game with a story that evolves to complement its combat gameplay mechanics, rather than a deep story experience with great action. That to me is a kind of lost art. Too many games, or pretty much any medium entertainment, these days require complex reasons or explanations of why something has to be exactly like so to be there. Though I'm not knocking against games that can pull that off well. I love the lore and environmental details of things like Silent Hill and Dark Souls that provide an indisputably particular feeling, but I also enjoy games that excel at doing exactly one thing, while having extra bits, so to speak. I think in a way, the game wants you to understand this too. I wasn't particularly aroused by the story, background lore of characters, or the overall cause that the game is going for, yet it works well enough, I suppose. Immortals engaging in wars against each other with their pawns or servants at the helm, as it becomes a metaphorical game of dominion of cultural affluence and power with something more sinister occurring in the background, as details are hidden from you, which your group is against odds. It colors the game just enough in a particular way to stand out, but doesn't really detract or add much to the richness of the overall vision or the product, I'd say.
Absolum is mine. It must be. The fate of all depends on it.
Also, the playable characters are considered wizards, and Carl, that dwarf fellow that primarily punches people and uses a gun. Yes, he's a wizard, clearly. So as I've mentioned before, game feel. The way that the animations, hit effects, camera work, sound design, and other elements of the action game design fit together like a glove. Animations in particular are some of the best hand-drawn frames I've ever seen in a 2D action game overall, and are integrated well with the game's mechanics of clash and deflect. Clashing is some of the most fun I've ever had interacting with the game's mechanics on a technical level, as it's basically a parry, but to me, clashes are far more impressive to pull off, especially in the heat of the moment, and the immediate benefit immediately sparks that monkey brain moment of throwing out combos. The flex worked really well, just like Sekiro's Mikiri counter of rushing into danger to step into an advantageous state, which alongside dodges really makes you think of what options work when. Aerial attack properties, roll mechanics, and your special arcana attacks that require mana that resemble things like EX attacks in Street Fighter. There's of course far more going on than this, and it's the type of game that rewards mastery as it is consistently expecting you to do so. Discovering the depths of Absolum for yourself is definitely worth it alone, and you really gotta try it yourself to fully understand what makes it so great. In the 10 hours it took to get my first clear, I felt like I was cooking up magic. The build came together and I was able to personally string up my first out-of-this-world combo. The game is so fantastically good at pivoting you towards learning the systems of the game intuitively that it cannot be understated how well you naturally pick up on things simply by visually identifying things like hit lag, recovery, combo endings, and the like to incorporate and experiment with. For instance, after the second boss, you can start obtaining upgrades that give you more moveset abilities. For Galandra, I tried the dive kick previously, yet I didn't understand how to incorporate this into my combo strings. Yet somehow, I was able to figure out that it works well as an extension after her heavy attack, which usually acts as mainly as a clash intended move or okizemi or a meaty or a follow-up to catch an enemy from a hard knockdown state. The dive kick allows you to catch an enemy as you string normal attacks into your heavy clash, and then catch them with a dive kick mid-air. Combine this with your special moves, and now suddenly you're playing Devil May Cry in 2D, as you can use dive kicks to both vertically and horizontally extend your combo routes nearly infinitely. All this feels so intuitive that you just simply get it without thinking about it, which is fantastic game design. In a way, it reminds me a lot of Devil May Cry in that respect of implicitly encouraging you to extend combos. What I also think the game does really well is to provide you with a real sense of difference in each run as you try out different routes, new RNG elements of hazards, opportunities, bosses, builds that keep you on your toes. Some of the character builds themselves are really unique, as stuff like extra jumps, creating minions or throwables, benefits based on clash, deflection, or dodging make things feel different enough each run. Yet the core gameplay still shines throughout. It doesn't reach the levels of variability of builds like in Hades, but there's also the limitation of being a 2D side-scrolling brawling game, however. Yet, they're also incredibly varied in themselves, but you gotta go through the meta progression unlocks first. They want to familiarize you with the base mechanics first before the gimmicks, which is great design, IMO. For me, getting the last elemental crystal, which you can think of as different god boons like in Hades, took me about 15 hours in, though I wasn't exactly looking for it. The The game's progression of unlocking new upgrades, mechanics, quests, and meta progression overall feels extremely smooth as it tries to relax you into experimenting and trying new things first, which is great for people like me who've never played a beat 'em up before. I've enjoyed pretty much every moment, even when losing, as I don't particularly mind, as the game surprised me with more interesting things, more paths, and goals to work towards, as I came to grips with how to play the game. There are secrets, alternative enemies, in-game events that alter your expectations in a way that just works in the 2D medium. When you thought you understood everything, the game is like, here's a little something more. The game sprinkles unique gimmicks and things to do in just the best way that also helps distinguish routes and decision making of progressing who or what in a fantastic way that really itches that one more run. And local co-op. To me, this is also nostalgia speaking, but this elevates the game from a mid or high 8 out of 10 rating easily to around a 9 out of 10. Playing this with someone over one screen is peak gaming, not only because it is a beat 'em up, but also because of how well incorporated and thought out cooperative play is. The gameplay opens up much more to account for an extra player with more enemies, HP scaling, and managing all of it with strategy involved with build decisions and synergize, and all of it's quite deep. I don't have gameplay for it unfortunately, but when I was playing Cider, the Strider Ninja Gaiden style speedy character, whose main gimmick is the arm grapple, I was able to get a build that enabled me to maintain a steady supply of throwables whenever you use one, while spawning a skeleton army when casting my Arcana abilities. The other player had a build that focused on mana gain with Braum, the Frog Wizard, that also spawned throwables whenever he casted an Arcana spell. Safe to say, the screen was filled with nonsense as we turned the whole map into visual diarrhea of explosions and hit effects. It was glorious. As a small side note, I have to say, the game will attempt to push new limits from you, as it isn't an easy game I would say, though you could just say this is my inexperience with the beat-em-up genre overall. It's definitely a technical mechanics first type game, unlike games that allow you to get away with not utilizing the interactions, and getting away with it, as it makes sure that you understand that you will get punished, and why, but not to a degree which is too harsh. Usually, the first time I went up against a new boss, or several times, I would generally lose, but this game is definitely for those who have a mentality to stick with things to see a process through. I personally don't mind losing at all, as I can see what works and what doesn't, and experiment with builds, which assuredly got me further every new run. Some things the game doesn't do well is honestly the way that it integrates ideas borrowed from other games. Environmental dialogue points a la Hades are really short, about a sentence each usually, as it's usually just a description in of itself. There's a distinctively flowery way in which Hades is able to pull it off while Homer somewhat snarkily or somberly expresses himself that works for what Hades is going for. For Absolum, it doesn't really work as well in my opinion, as Hades pulls from well-known mythological elements that provide something interesting or well-read. It in itself may be meta or a fourth wall breaking element that enhances the experience, which Zagreus or Melinoe's retorts provide great subtle characterization. Also, there's a great big deal of these lines too, unlike Absolum. You don't really get much of that interactive flair in Absolum or player interaction stuff overall. There's sparingly few spoken interactions with your playable characters based on actions you've done, as it does wonders in making characters feel alive when they greet their villains and like. I feel like it definitely could use more, but I understand as well that the medium may not be the best presentation of it, as again, action first, everything else is kinda second. This also applies between characters, and generic repeated lines for boss fights at the end of the big bad's intro dialogue is definitely not great though. What few lines that actually do exist for player character banter will also repeat throughout runs, so it's a bit dry in that regard. Yet, if the developers decided to put in a game, they might as well have more of it is my opinion. It makes the game and the characters stand out more, and what little they have is actually pretty great.
There's no treasure where you're going, big fella. There's no treasure where you...
Difficulty overall is hard to specify, as there are some story spoiler related circumstances that change the difficulty in a rather awesome way. When you beat the game for the first time, you're falling not only to bosses that now have expanded movesets, you also start seeing enemies from later stages spawning into earlier ones, more hazards, or new hazards, and so on. It works well, but I must note that some of the bosses past the Gatekeeper's second major boss aren't particularly difficult, challenging, or interesting. That, or some of which are harder than the other ones. Perhaps because I had the most wackiest builds to trivialize some of them, but some of them felt like filler rather than what the game expected you to think from previous encounters. While I'd say boss is overall fantastic, and the difficulty is pretty challenging for some stuff, some of them feel as if they're designed specifically as gimmick encounters that aren't too engaging. They're also optional intentionally high difficulty pathways, however, with more rewards. And the game encourages taking risks and mastery over it, as you can choose roguelike buff items if you decide not to take healing in between rest areas.
And I can't fly.
Silence often spells danger.
Not the shakes.
If you listen from time to time, you might end up learning something.
While I have to say that the presentation itself is passable, some elements of it clearly could use some more work. I don't think that the seemingly random static background characters or the character portraits during dialogue work well for the game. When you have this constant sway of animations that blend together so well, as you can see for things such as player idle animations, having a focus specifically on a static element is a bit jarring. But I get it, the animation intention itself is to distinguish the player character from the background, hence the lower update rate. But other characters are animated too, so it just feels unfinished and a bit awkward. Character portraits in particular aren't the greatest. If you take how Hades 2 does it, for example, there are design elements and flourishes that makes it so looking at a 2D image is more nuanced with animated effects, flourishes of symbolism, and most importantly, they aren't exactly the focal point generally of what you are staring at. Since the characters you generally interact with mainly aren't supreme beings in Absolum, they can't really leverage that as it doesn't seem to be the focus, and the game shows portraits dead center almost. It's fine really, but IMO, portraits don't really have to be in the game given that the idle animated characters are actually better visuals when they exist, or should have been done in a way that complements the game's style more, as they can be used for animation outside of a combat association, which the game kinda lacks.
Simply not exist, and we will not serve a master.
Another complaint I have is that the level designs themselves aren't that great, while visually, the environmental art design associated with it is incredibly varied and excellent. However, most levels are basically long rectangles with a lack of space moving up or down. Some levels do have a bit more than that, but overall I wish that it did more of it sooner, as you find a lot of these gimmicks further into the game than earlier. While the visual decor and ornaments, so to speak, fit well with the areas that they are presenting, I think that the level designs themselves are still a bit lacking even if they do change it up a bit. Most of the verticality associated with levels is essentially for transitions of plot of point A to point B, so fortunately, I think this is the only element of more substantial criticism I have, as most of the stuff I pointed out is generally nitpicking. This may be just beat 'em ups in particular, but sometimes there really is too many things going on the screen that makes it hard to orientate yourself, so you might lose track of your character sometimes. For me, if you lose concentration but for a moment in the later encounters, you might get that lost feeling of, where was my character again? This is especially true in co-op, as camera motion, at least to me, is related to how I orientate myself in games. I know that there is an option to turn on character highlights to make your character more visible, but enemies get a bit more cluttered regardless, so it's hard to decipher what they are doing rather than what you are doing. This is especially prevalent in later stages which have so many dudes on the screen at once. Manageable of course, but you may find a few builds lacking if you don't have some sort of AoE or multi-hit arcana attacks, and things of that nature. I will say, however, most of the complaints or negatives, however, fit the medium well. Specifically, if you like a game that's all about getting into action as soon as possible with the least amount of constraints, restrictions, or friction, as the game design reflects this really well. I did run into a rare few bugs, which had enemies floating in the air or out of the bounds essentially, but the game corrects itself as a failsafe, or dialogue markers and quest complete markers that keep showing up, but it did really hurt the experience overall. While playing, I often got that sense of, wow, they even accounted for this? Pretty often. It's pretty well polished overall. There's a certain way in which good action games facilitate a flow state that not only brandishes it so brazenly, but goes beyond that enables you to say, hey, I want to keep going. And to me, that is the
Show me your motivation.
Virgil type stuff that makes me not only glad that it can push you naturally to achieve it, but relishes in the idea of how can I go even further against the odds. Frankly, it's positively electrifying. Its faults are easily negligible for what it does right. Easily a 9 out of 10 game for me. You know, I heard before that the greatest compliment that you can give a game is that you want to keep playing it, but I'll go one more even beyond. I think of the game sometimes when I'm not playing it, thinking that I could pull off something or do something better as I rationalize experimenting the motions through my head. Something I got with Devil May Cry. I freaking love combo-based games. To me, Absolum allows you to play at your hardest trying to pull off the coolest thing you can while juggling new things in the process with the randomness of abilities, enemies, locales, events, and much more. I think although it is well rated, it could use more coverage as it's simply an incredible delight to play, and deserves more of a spotlight as larger titles like Battlefield and Arc Raiders are likely to drown out some of the interest for indie games at the moment. The best thing is that they are implying more and new content underway from what I've read from their Steam post about the future of the game. More characters, more stages, and bosses hopefully. Thank you if you made it to this part of the video, as I'd like to ask you to subscribe to my channel as it helps a lot. It's strange as that video on Sulfur I started out with like 3 to 4 subscribers, and seeing it increase to nearly 40 since then is awesome. I'd be curious to see if I can hit triple or quadruple digits or even beyond. But in any case, what are your thoughts about Absolum? Are you interested in picking up the game? Having a blast? Something to note about it that stood out to you? I'd love to hear your thoughts.
If I were to marry you, and we had a barn or two, I shall break their bones before they're grown. I'd work for bread to keep them fed for the rest of my life, so there would never a sailor be, so there would never a sailor be.
Bravo! Bravo!